Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all welcome you all for coming to this very special event. You know very well that our region, and that is East Asia and Pacific, has very, very rapidly aging population. And also we all know that it has tremendous critical implications, not only economic, but socio-political. This aging in demography is a quite certain thing. It's quite predictable. And yet we have to be prepared for it. Fortunately, the World Bank recently has produced a report on aging in this region. And this morning, we have two distinguished economists from World Bank who will tell us all about their findings and implications, and particularly policy implications for Korea. The speakers this morning is Dr. Sudhir Shetty, who is chief economist at the World Bank for East Asia and Pacific, and Dr. Philip O'Keefe, who is lead economist at the World Bank for Social Protection and Labor Global Practice. Both economists have been with World Bank for many years, since late 1980s and early 1990s. And particularly, I know the Philip O'Keefe has been personally engaged in this study. Before I invite them, let me just recognize some of the guests here. I'm sorry I cannot recognize everyone, but I just want to recognize a few. We have Dr. Ki-wan Kim, who was president of KDI and is our ambassador, a roving ambassador. And also National Assemblyman Lee Jae-young. I'm sure he's ready for election soon. And we have many guests from diplomatic corps. Particularly, we have Joy Yamamoto, who is economic counsel at U.S. Embassy, but she is here particularly on behalf of Ambassador Lippert, and she is accompanying the Joyce. Actually, I forgot to introduce Joyce Musuya, who is World Bank representative here in Korea. Actually, she worked hard to arrange this meeting. And we have ambassador from Netherlands, the Lodi Embrit, and ambassador from New Zealand there, and we have ambassador from Rwanda. Yes. Well, I'm sorry I cannot recognize everyone, but with this brief introduction, and let me invite two speakers talk all about aging in our society. I don't know who will come first. Dr. Shetty?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you also for all coming, and thank you very much to Dr. Il-suk for inviting us this morning and hosting us. As he mentioned, we've been doing this report on East Asia, aging in East Asia and Pacific. unusually somewhat for the World Bank. As you know, mostly we focus on developing countries, but given the theme of this report, we spent a little more time and effort than usual looking at some of the richer countries in the region as well, for obvious reasons. Japan, Korea and Singapore in particular. So we've tried to kind of show the spectrum of experience across the region on ageing issues. I'll start, if I can, with just a few of the kind of big picture messages of the report and then go through some of the evidence and more specific findings as we go. The first is, and I think Dr. Il-Sung has already made that point, East Asia already has more older people than any region in the world. It's not something that actually many people outside the region think of necessarily. We think of maybe Japan as a super aging society or specific countries, but one tends to think of Asia as a young, dynamic region. And in fact, Asia is home to about 36% of the world's population 65 and over already, East Asia Pacific. And of that population, of course, China accounts for the bulk of them, but many countries are aging, as we'll see. More importantly, I think, apart from the stock, which is already high, is the pace at which Asia is aging. And that pace is faster than any region we have seen in history to date. And a country like Korea is itself an excellent illustration of just that speed of aging that we've witnessed. The second general point, in a number of ways, we think the challenges posed by countries that are already aged or are rapidly aging are real, but that, as we say in the report, demography is not destiny. As Dr. Il-Sung said, it's something we know is going to happen. All those people born today are going to hopefully reach a ripe old age in 80 or 90 years' time. But public policy and behavioural responses will really determine what the consequences of that are in economic terms, in fiscal terms and others. So while the demography is destiny, the outcomes and the economic impacts of demography are by no means destiny. And we find that East Asia Pacific, compared to many other regions that have aged in the past, Eastern Europe, even Latin America, certainly most OECD countries, is better prepared for a number of reasons that we'll show you. The third general point is, and I know this is a big debate in Korea at the moment, ageing policies are not just about old people. That's really critical. Of course, they are partly about old people, pensions policies or other things like that, but that they deal with policies across the life cycle. And I know the debates, for example, on fertility in Korea and how to reverse fertility decline are a very good example of that. Ageing policies start before birth and continue right through to throughout life. What we find generally for developing East Asia is that the fiscal risks are the biggest risks. While there are risks to growth, we think they are manageable, but the fiscal risks are in some countries very high, and particularly in pensions area, but to a lesser extent health and long-term care. That is, I would distinguish Korea itself a little bit on that front. To me, I think probably the labour market issues and the way that ageing plays through in the labour market may be possibly a bigger challenge in Korea than it is in some other countries. But of course that has fiscal implications also. And of course the final point which we witness in Korea, we witness in many countries in the region, is it's all very well to say policy and behavioural responses can manage this, but politically nearly every one of these policy responses, as we know from around the world, is extremely challenging. Reforming pension systems in any country in the world will generally get people out on the street. Reforming labour markets is always challenging, healthcare, etc. So they're the kind of overarching messages. Some of the numbers first, and the number of East Asia, and they're kind of the regional numbers you see there of population 65 and above. East Asia in 2015, around 211 million people of that age. Of that, China is 130 million of that number. So you could say it's a China problem, not an East Asia problem, if you like. But in relative terms, as we'll see, China is by no means the only country that's rapidly ageing. And this is, I mean, somewhat capturing some of that pace of ageing over time. You see the blue line, of which these are the richer, high-income East Asian countries, that of which Korea is one in the report, the way we group them. And you see that really dramatic shift. I mean, they go from way behind the OECD. The OECD is the orange line down here, and rapidly overtake it. And Korea, of course, is in that process. China itself is the red line. So even China, by the end of that period, 2060, has overtaken the OECD in terms of the share of elderly people. The younger countries, though, and this is another important point, the diversity in the region, and that offers some potential, we think. This darker purple line is the kind of poorer countries generally in the region, the Laos, Cambodias, Myanmars, and that's a much younger profile, as you would expect. But that pace of ageing I can't emphasise enough. The UN measures, for example, going from 7 to 14% of an elderly population as going from ageing to an aged society. That's their kind of standard measure. France took more than 100 years to do that. Korea did it in about, I think, 18 years. Vietnam will do it in about 16 years. So that has a lot of, that speed of transition has a lot of implications. The other point, and this was pointed out, being in an East Asian country, somebody said this looks like a plate of noodles yesterday, and it does somewhat, I appreciate. But the basic point here is that not only are the countries ageing, and they're ageing fast, but they're ageing generally at very low incomes. So compared to countries in the past, the horizontal axis here is the elderly dependency ratio, basically the ratio of elderly people to working age population. And you see the income levels of most of East Asia are clustering around here at points when, I mean, Singapore at an extreme, but Korea itself was much higher income. Some of them are quite worrying. I mean, if you look at Thailand is a good example, where you're drifting to the right of that picture in a fairly flat way, and the risk is you end up somewhere out here at this kind of relatively low income level. Korea is an interesting case. Here we are here. Korea's had quite a nice trajectory so far. I guess the real question, look at Korea and what happened to Japan at almost exactly the same point. That was the point at which Japan flattened, where the kind of pace of ageing started to outstrip the pace of growth very rapidly. And so a real question for Korea is, do you kind of follow that steep Singapore trajectory from this point, or do you run the risk that you flatten in growth as you age? So the old before rich is a really strong theme of the report. One of the consequences of some of these demographics is on the labour market side, and this is working age population. And Korea, as you see, is one of the sharpest declines in working age population between 2010 and 2040, over 15% decline in working age population. In contrast, and this is where you see the diversity of the region so nicely, in contrast, some of those younger, generally poorer countries on the right-hand side, their labour forces continue to grow throughout this period. Now, I should give a caveat on Korea here. This is a standard kind of ILO definition, 15 to 64, which is kind of global definition of working age population. The somewhat good news for Korea here is that that's not the working age norm for Koreans. In fact, Koreans work till 70 or above on average and have the second highest effective rate of withdrawal from the labour force, age of withdrawal from the labour force of any country in the OECD except Mexico. So Koreans actually, this is, that decline may not be quite as steep, but nonetheless it's something to, and I know the government is very focused on, and no doubt we'll pick up in discussion. A couple of other points. One of the kind of, I guess, myths that we have when we encounter a lot of East Asian policymakers, particularly in developing East Asia, when we talk about things like pension systems, social protection systems, is that the family looks after them. The family will take care of these old people. They always have and they always will. So we don't necessarily need a pension system for everyone, or this is a kind of common response. In fact, if you look at this chart, and these are the primary sources of income, the blue bars are labour income. Most old people across the region are still supporting themselves. Their primary source of support is their own work, their own labour. The top bar is the rural population. The bottom bar is the bottom figure is the urban population. Again, I would point to Korea. Korea is pretty unusual here. You see, in the urban areas, the labour is there. I mean, labour is really a significant share. That's very unusual for a country at Korea's level of income. Most countries at Korea's level of income look like Mongolia or something thereabout, where transfers, often public pensions, often state transfers of some form, are their dominant. So if you look at Latin America, if you look at Eastern Europe, of countries that are anywhere near Korea's level of income, they look a lot more like Mongolia looks in that picture. So Korea's pretty unusual there, and that reflects how late people work. Despite that, unfortunately, the poverty rate of elderly people in Korea is very high. Even though they work long and they work hard, their poverty rates are really high. And if you look across the OECD, Korea's elderly poverty rates are far and away higher than any other country in the OECD, despite working long and despite working hard. And we'll see a couple of reasons for that in the following slide. So moving on to policy side of things, some of the policy challenges, priorities. These are the four broad areas I'd like to touch on. The first is impacts on growth and why we think East Asia Pacific is perhaps in a better position than many regions of the world to cope with ageing. Second is in the labour market. Third, on pension systems, and finally on healthcare and long-term care. Of course, there are many more issues, policy issues and others that one could deal with ageing, but I think these are pretty chunky issues to cover in themselves. The first one on growth. If we look back at not only Korea, but all the so-called East Asian tigers, from the period from the 60s to the 90s, the demographic dividend, as it's so-called, the explosion in working age population in that period, accounted for somewhere between 30 and 40% of the growth that we saw. So it made a really substantial contribution to that period of blockbuster growth that we saw in a number of these East Asian countries. The worry is, of course, from demographers and economists that you move from a demographic dividend to a demographic tax as that reverses and as labour forces decline. We find in the report, though, that that's too mechanical. It's not as simple as that, and thankfully it's not as simple as that, for a variety of reasons, not all of which apply to Korea, but this is for the developing countries primarily. The first is that savings rates are already very high in most East Asian countries. In China, you're looking at kind of 35%, numbers like that, really high household savings rates. So the normal concern that as people get old, they run down their savings and there's no stock of savings is a much more diluted concern in a country like China and in a number of the developing East Asian countries. That's unfortunately not the case in Korea. Your household savings rate is much lower. I think it's 4 to 6% depending on the year you look at. The second, and certainly does apply to Korea very strongly, is that the educational attainment across the region has gone from often quite low levels, really very, very rapidly improved. And Korea is a wonderful example of that. So what it means is, despite the fact that you're going to have fewer workers, your quality of workers has increased dramatically. So the productivity per worker is likely to be higher, and other effects like the capital The third area I won't go into now, which are the kind of reforms that can mitigate the effects of ageing, because we'll come to that in the next slides. But the fourth point I think is an interesting one, an important one, is that the potential of an ageing population to stimulate domestic consumption in most countries can't be underestimated. China, as you know, is trying to rebalance its model towards more domestic consumption. In an unexpected way, the ageing of the population may actually assist them in that process. So there may be some macro effects that weren't anticipated and certainly weren't planned for, but are unintentionally positive. And it will also create or either stimulate markets that are emerging. Internet of Things was something we were talking about with Ilse Kong earlier, but that's an example applied to ageing. But a whole host of areas, whether it be healthcare, whether it be tourism, whether it be robotics, there are new markets to look at. BCG, for example, did a study a few years ago looking at what proportion of increased consumer spending would come from the population over 55 in a number of countries between 28 and 2030. In Japan, that was 2/3 of the increased consumer spending was going to come from that population. In America, it was 50%. In Germany, it was 85%. So this group, as a consumer group, one should not underestimate. So it's on the growth side, we're somewhat sanguine, as I mentioned. The Labor side, clearly, as was said in the introduction, it's unavoidable. These things are happening. They will happen in terms of the strict working age population. But we focus on a number of things in the report, which I won't dwell on all of them, but the first one is female labour force participation. Second is extending working lives and in various ways. And the third is immigration in some countries. I'd like to just focus on a couple of those. In Korea, the extending working lives is not as high a priority, but the female labour force participation and the immigration we think hold great potential. This is the first one, looking at a baseline of what will happen with the labour force in Korea. The baseline is the blue line, and the effect. The higher line, the female labour force, is if you gradually converge female labour force participation to male labour force participation by 2040. As you see, if you did that, just that one, well, it's not the most straightforward thing to do, but if you did that one reform, you would still have a labour force of a larger size than today out to 2040 and beyond. We appreciate it's difficult to do, but that's... In contrast, the extending the working lives, because people are already working so long, it doesn't have as much potential to expand the workforce. The second one, this shows you some of the kind of immigration simulations. This is not for Korea specifically, but for a composite of countries, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore and Hong Kong, I think. Here, again, you see the baseline is the bottom line. Again, the grey line, elderly labour force participation, doesn't have a lot of potential in these countries because they're already working long. But the immigration numbers start to add up, and particularly permanent immigration, the yellow line. Now, this is very easy to say, we know. Immigration is there can't be a more sensitive issue, whether we look at, Mr. Trump in the United States at the moment, or the debate in Europe about Syrian refugees, or wherever you look around the world. My own country, Australia, immigration will always be a touch point issue. And we know in Korea, with the cultural, linguistic and other sensitivities, it's not straightforward. But with the very low immigration base that Korea and Japan have, compared and contrasted to Singapore, to Hong Kong, to Australia, to New Zealand, there seems to be significant potential there over time, as challenging as it will be. Moving on to pensions. First point in the report is the vast majority of people in this region, East Asia Pacific, don't have a pension. You see these numbers there. The vertical axis is coverage of the working age population, and you see that many of the countries, particularly low-income countries, virtually no one, unless you're a civil servant or a member of the army, has a pension. But even in the Indonesias of the world, Philippines and others, it's a lot lower than one would hope. It's pretty much formal sector civil servants. Korea is in a significantly better position there, but nonetheless, a lot of countries are struggling to expand coverage. Despite that, though, the expectations of people for financial support from the state are very high. The orange bars there are the people who, or the proportion of people who expect that the state will be their primary source of financial support in old age. So we see a real, and the doubly interesting thing is here, that expectation is higher for the poorer countries than it is for the richer countries. And Korea actually probably has the most realistic expectations in many ways of any country. But that mismatch between what the state is doing and what people expect it to do in the future is really pronounced and quite a political economy concern in a number of these countries. Just briefly on the fiscal side, we go into this in some detail in the report, but just to give you one illustration, the chart on the left is for a whole set of kind of simulated APEC countries using their policies and their demography of what pension spending might look like over the next 50 years or so without reforms. And these are numbers that, get up to levels that we know countries in East Asia just do not find acceptable and probably will not be able to raise the revenue to support. The one on the right is if you just take two reforms, one of them very challenging, one of them typically less so, raising retirement age to 65 in all the countries and indexing pensions to prices rather than wages. These are not the only reforms that many of the countries need to do, but you see that even with just those two reforms, politically challenging again, how much you can impact those kind of fiscal risks. The situation in Korea is somewhat different to the pattern we see in the region. Korea, in general, with its pension system, has done a lot of very sensible reforms. It's adjusted the parameters of its pension system to be fairly fiscally sustainable. It's expanded coverage with the matching contributions. It's introduced a social pension. It's done nearly all the policy measures that this report recommends countries should consider. But where it faces difficulties is it started very late. Korea's pension system was introduced at a point in demographic transition that was well after most countries introduced a national mandated pension system. So as a result, you get this current situation where the replacement rate, the kind of relative to wages of the pension in Korea is still very low. That will change over coming years. It's an immature system so far, so people are still building their accumulations. But at the moment, you've got this transitional generation that has very low pensions, that we mentioned earlier has quite high poverty rates, and that's going to be a real challenge to navigate for the next 20 to 30 years as the pension system matures. We're not suggesting that everybody get up to Vietnam's level. In fact, Vietnam's at a level that it cannot support fiscally. That's not a feasible target, but somewhere around 40, 50% replacement rate is probably about right, and I think that's where Korea wants to go, but you've got this transitional generation issue. Last two slides. Health systems first. We estimate, and this estimating future health spending makes estimating pension spending seem like child's play. Pensions is money in, money out. You can kind of estimate and fiddle with the numbers a bit and come up with estimates that are reasonably reliable. Health spending has so many other variables: consumer demand, provider behaviour, technology change, extra longevity, all these factors. So it's very hard to predict. But generally we estimate that ageing itself will account for about a third of the health spending increase in the region over coming decades. The rest will be largely technology and policy choices. In the case of East Asia, expanding coverage primarily in developing East Asia. But the policy things for ageing, this is a classic example of where one needs to work across the life cycle. So There's the whole exposure to risks agenda in this region. Things like smoking, salt intake are very high and very high risk factors. But also early in life, there's a lot more research now showing how early child nutrition and other factors impacts later life health. The two I'd really point to here that I think are important for Korea and particularly important for countries like China and Vietnam. The first is that hospital systems, or health systems generally in the region, are very hospital-centric. You get sick in China, you go straight to the hospital. You don't go to a general practitioner, you don't go to a primary care provider of some form. You go straight to the hospital. When you get to the hospital, you get over-serviced, you get over-drugged, and you get over-admitted and kept in hospital. That's an extremely costly way to deal with what are often basic blood pressure, diabetes management, or chronic care issues that should be managed at primary care. So restructuring health systems away from overemphasis on hospitals towards a bigger emphasis for primary care will be particularly important as these societies age. The second one at the bottom is that doing that will cost money and will cost a lot of investment in training, creating a cadre of GPs, etc. So to do that, you have to have a lot of other efficiency reforms in the system. How providers are paid, how pharmaceuticals are procured, how technology is procured. And in the report, we highlight Korea as a good example on some of those. The way you procure pharmaceuticals here in your health insurance system, the way you procure technology, the way you prioritise what services are provided within the health insurance package, we think are really good models for other countries in the region that they could learn a lot from. Final slide, long-term care. Well, I know in Korea you're way ahead on this. You have your long-term care insurance, you have a pretty well-developed network of facilities. In the rest of the region, there basically is no public long-term care financing or delivery system. It has been the family, or if you're very wealthy, you're now getting the private market entering in places like Thailand or China. But that's not going to hold. With the change in demographics, with things like urbanisation, with things like families living apart more and more, that system can't do it anymore, particularly as people get older. So governments will have to get involved, and they're better actively to get involved and take a proactive policy choice rather than let it happen by default through the health system, which is a very expensive way to provide long-term care. And we emphasise here very much the home-based community care, that kind of direction that one sees in other parts of the world. The financing is going to be probably the biggest challenge that many of these countries face. Korea is an interesting model with its long-term care financing. Japan is doing the same. Taiwan, China is introducing one also. So they may be interesting models for other countries to look at. That's it from me. Thank you. So it's a quick and dirty summary of the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Sakong, for inviting us, and thank you to all of you. So we actually had a technological problem. We were going to do it the obvious way, which was do the short term first and then the long term. But because of our technological problem, we've turned it around. So you have the long term perspective, but I'm going to tell you, actually the title of this was Navigating the Global Uncertainty. So this is about what we, as different economies, what different economies will have to do to get to dealing with the problems that Pip spoke about. So the key points here that I'm going to make, and I should give you a little bit of context. Every 6 months at the World Bank, we do something called the East Asia Economic Update. And in that, we focus on the economic prospects and challenges for what we call developing East Asia and the Pacific. Now, that doesn't obviously include Korea, but it includes all of the countries of this region, obviously China, but in addition to China, everything the World Bank calls East Asia and Pacific, which is everything from Myanmar east down to the Pacific. And we do that at the time of our annual meetings in October and the spring meetings. And this is a little bit of an update on that. And I think all of you will agree that this is the current period, especially today is December 15th. Tomorrow just a couple of blocks from where the World Bank and the IMF sit, Janet Yellen and the Federal Reserve Board will make a decision that has been anticipated for at least the last 3 years as to when they'll finally raise interest rates. And I think the betting now is that they will raise interest rates. And so that's clearly one of the uncertainties that lies ahead. But the other uncertainty, and one that weighs particularly heavily in this region, is about China's growth rate and where that is headed. A third point is about commodity prices. We're now seeing oil plumbing new lows, falling to below $35 a barrel. And all expectations are that it's likely to remain very low. So the main point that I'm going to try to leave you with is that this is a very uncertain time. And because it's an uncertain time, it requires, in most countries, and here I'm speaking particularly of developing East Asia and the Pacific, but we can talk a little bit around the implications for Korea if you like. But it'll require a combination of macroeconomic prudence and continued structural reform. And the good news for this region, for developing, this is not a good time for any region of the world. But and I say this all the time when I talk to my colleagues who work on Latin America or who work on the Middle East, if you had to choose a region to be part of, East Asia and Pacific is probably where you'd want to be. This is a part of the world where 4% is still considered low. In Latin America, I think if you gave Brazil even 0.5% at this point, I think they'd be pretty pleased. So let me begin with kind of the big picture. Where have we come in terms of global growth and where are we headed? And I think the title says it all, which is it's a disappointing year. And that bar there is what represents global growth. The shaded areas are projections. And what we're looking at is something around 2.5% for global growth this year. And you'll see it pretty flat coming off of the global financial, after that initial recovery of the global financial crisis. Developing countries a little bit higher, around 4.5%, but still pretty disappointing. Now, more disappointing than this is this picture, which shows you how systematically over-optimistic we've been in projecting growth. So what you see there, those diamonds are the outturns of growth, and the bars are the projections. So we were not optimistic coming right off the global financial crisis in 2010, but since then we've been systematically over-optimistic. We've anticipated that growth will be higher than it actually has been. Those diamonds are lower than the bars. And the right-hand side shows you how often we've had to downgrade growth projections for emerging market economies. This is a group of 24 emerging market economies every year. And it's about 50% in the latest year. This just shows you how we've had to downgrade expectations for 2015 for a range of developing countries, oil exporters, oil importers, the BRICS. And again, you see that as time has gone on in 2015, we've gotten more and more pessimistic. A final point here is what is also going on now is what we call a synchronized slowdown across large emerging markets. The only exception to this is India. Every other country is slowing. And the left-hand side there shows you how much worse these 24 emerging market economies are doing, are likely to do in 2015, compared to either an average just before the global financial crisis in the early 2000s or a longer-term average from 1980. And the right-hand side shows you the number of emerging market economies that have been slowing for 3 consecutive years, and you see those bars beginning to rise in the last 2 or 3 years since 2013. Now, against this, there are other dark clouds on the horizon. Global trade has been, the recovery of global trade since the global financial crisis has been very slow. You see those forecasts of global trade growth for 2015 and how they've come down consistently since October 2011. You see global import growth very low. this is a picture you all know. Obviously, in Korea, you're on the good side of this. But if you were in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in any commodity exporting, and obviously the Middle East, this would be a very concerning picture. And what's interesting on the left-hand side is you see that precipitous drop in energy prices in 2014. But what you also see is what happened to other commodity prices, metals, agriculture, that slow decline since 2011. And on the right-hand side, you see part of the reason why emerging market economies are slowing in the way they are. It shows you just how dependent many of them are on commodity exports of different kinds. And this is a very worrisome trend. Earlier on, we were talking to Dr. Sakong about productivity growth and about whether, what is the new normal. And here you see how much productivity, total factor productivity growth, which at the end of the day is the only thing that drives growth, particularly in a context of an aging world. And you see how it's been slowing in emerging market economies. And on that right-hand side, you see how productivity growth has slowed in the last 5 years coming off the global financial crisis, how it compares to the long-term average between 1980 and 2008. And finally, this is a picture of volatility. We of course saw this big time in August after the Chinese stock market crash and the renminbi depreciation. But what seems to happen is every time there's a little flutter somewhere, the markets go into a complete frenzy. And you're seeing that whether in terms of rising political risk indices and volatility indices on the left, or in terms of sovereign bond spreads for emerging market economies on the right. So to summarize this, what do we see ahead for the region? What we see for the region is slowing growth primarily reflecting China's slowing growth. So what we expect for China is is likely to grow at close to 6.9 or 7% in 2015, but slow to about 6.7 and then to 6.5% in 2016 and 2017. That will mean that East Asia and Pacific, developing East Asia and Pacific as we define it at the World Bank, will slow to about 6%, a little over 6%, and that's largely because of China's slowdown. But leaving aside China, because we expect Indonesia to pick up a little bit, we expect Thailand to pick up a little bit. Leaving aside China, we expect East Asia and the Pacific to grow close to about 4.8% in 2016 and possibly around 5% in 2017. But all of this, though, this is the second bullet, all of this assumes two things. One, that you have a gradual slowdown in China. You don't have what people like to refer to as a hard landing in China, that what you see is what I said, that Chinese growth decelerates gradually to about 6.5%. And second, what we also assume in this baseline is that you have, that tomorrow the Fed will raise rates, they'll raise it gradually, markets will not go crazy, and everyone will adjust in an orderly fashion. And really the uncertainties for the economies in this region center around these two aspects. Now, this is just to illustrate how China has slowed, and that dark line gives you the year-on-year growth rates by quarter, and you can see the gradual slowing in China from that monetary stimulus right after the global financial crisis in 2011 to current rates in 2015. But this picture tells you something else about what's going on in China. What is going on in China is the rebalancing is happening. You are seeing Chinese growth rebalancing from investment-led growth to consumption-led growth. You're seeing it rebalancing from manufacturing and industry to services. And one of the effects of that is, this is some data from the OECD that we analyzed to look at what is happening to final demand in China for products from developing economies in East Asia. And this tells you that yellow line, the two lines at the top, the yellow one for the Philippines and the mustard one for Malaysia are particularly interesting because they show you the potential that a rebalanced China can offer for final, as a source of final demand for products from this region. This just gives you a sense of just how important Chinese tourism is becoming in the region, and you see in particular for countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, whether in terms of numbers of Chinese tourists or in terms of tourism revenues, China is a particularly important market. Now, this is coming to tomorrow, and this is just to give you a sense of just how low U.S. rates have been in historical terms for a protracted period. So this tells you why markets are so worried about what will eventually happen when the Fed starts raising interest rates. And what you see there is, if I can get the pointer, well, okay. So this is this is the actual Fed rate, and you can see that it's been close to zero between right after the global financial crisis. This is what we anticipate one possible path for increase might be, but since I can't read Janet Yellen's mind, I have no idea if this is going to be like this or if it's going to be even slower. But the interesting thing is, look at it in comparison to historical averages. This is the historical average since 1990. This is the historical average since 1980. This is the historical average since 1970. So the point is, it can only go up, and it can only go a long way up. So if you're a capital-dependent economy in East Asia, if you're like Malaysia, if you're like Indonesia, you have to be very, very concerned about where this is headed, and you've got to prepare for it. Finally, the trends in commodity prices. If you look at the right-hand panel there, you see that essentially we don't anticipate commodity prices to be going anywhere. They're going to remain flat. Energy prices may rise a little bit in the latter part of this period between 2016 and 2020, but we're looking essentially at flat real prices of metals and agriculture. So if you're a commodity exporting country, if you're Indonesia, if you're Malaysia, do not tie your fortunes to expectations of rising commodity prices. So just very quickly, so what does this mean in terms of challenges and opportunities? The first point it tells you, and this is a point we repeatedly emphasize in our discussions with policymakers in developing East Asia, is forget about countercyclical macroeconomic policies. Now, I know this isn't true about Korea. Korea is different. I'm talking about Malaysia. I'm talking about Indonesia. Countercyclical macro policies as a way of stimulating growth is not the answer. The good news is most of these countries are doing the right things. They have tightened the fiscal. They're following prudent monetary policies. And as in the case, for instance, of Malaysia or Indonesia, they've allowed their exchange rates to adjust, which is the right thing to do when you're faced with a major terms of trade shock, as these countries have faced. What it does, though, is it means you've got to deepen structural reforms. Now, this is one of those things that it's very easy for people like me and my colleagues at the IMF to say. You know, we sit in Washington, D.C., and we tell countries, deepen structural reforms. Yes, but just like some of the things that Pip spoke about earlier about dealing with aging, whether it's female labor force participation, whether it's immigration, these are politically very charged. The bad news, though, is that it's the only game in town. This, and I relate this back to my chart on productivity. If you're in a world where you're seeing total factor productivity fall at the kinds of levels of income that these countries are at currently, this is the only game in town. Now, so then the question for these countries is, what are the priority reforms? What should they be focusing on? Now, this is where, you know, we hear a lot of talk about the middle income trap. And I know that Korea is often touted, including by my colleagues who invented the phrase, the middle income trap, as the one country that escaped the middle income trap. Now, the way I like to think about these traps is, I don't think there's anything special like a middle income trap. I think there are traps at every level of income. I think Japan illustrates that there is a possible high income trap. You can get trapped at a very high, at a very comfortable level of income, and we see what that's done to Japan's standard of living. You see this at low income levels. You have lots of countries that don't make it out of low income. And you have it at various levels of middle income. You have it, you can have it at low middle income. You can have it at Malaysia's level, which is upper middle income. The point is, every country has to ask itself, what is biting? What is it that's preventing productivity from rising in our economies? In some countries, it's about education systems. In some countries, it's about trade. Just before this, I was in Malaysia, and I think one of Malaysia's big challenges is basic education. I think Malaysia's education outcomes are horrendous. There's the standardized test called the PISA, which you're aware of in Korea, and where Korea does very well. Malaysia does much worse even than Vietnam, with a much higher per capita income. Now, I think it is premature for Malaysia to start thinking about trying to become a knowledge economy when they're producing functionally illiterate children out of their primary and secondary schools. So if I were a Malaysian policymaker, I would double down and start thinking about what is it that is preventing my education system from producing kids who can read and do mathematics at a high enough level to compete in a global economy. Now this was intended, when I was supposed to go first, to be the transition, to be the segue to Pip's presentation, but let me give it very quickly anyways, because I think it also helps illustrate why the world is a challenging place in a longer term way. And what the left-hand side tells you, a piece of good news. If we were having this conversation 30 years ago and someone said, look, the population growth rate of the world is going to decline dramatically in the next 30 years, you'd have had a round of applause and everyone would have said, how wonderful, family planning is finally working. Well, the good news is it's working. Look at that population growth rate tanking across the world. But the bad news is on the right-hand side, which is the point that Pip made, which is what happens to working age populations. And what you see there is that the working age share of the global population has peaked. As a world, we have reached the peak of in terms of the share of the people who will be in the working age population. So we now need to start thinking as a world of some of the reforms that Pip was talking about. Now, of course, this is very different region by region, and that's what this picture shows you. And the broad thing, I mean, that's a very busy picture, but the broad thing I want you to take away from that is the bluer you are there, the more your population is going to grow in the next 35 years. So what you take away from there is there's only one part of the world that's really deep blue, and that's Africa. The latest Economist has a piece on this about how Africa is where the demographic growth is going to occur. But look at East Asia on the right-hand side. It's either light blue or it's various shades of brown. And the brown means you're seeing shrinking populations. So you can either be very dark brown, as in Japan. You can be a lighter shade of brown, as in Korea. And then you have other countries such as Thailand and others which are also going to see shrinking populations. And this globally is going to be the big challenge to manage, in addition, obviously, to climate change. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Actually, I got wrong the PowerPoint yesterday, so I was expecting Dr. Shetty to cover the current economic terrain of this region, but yesterday sent me wrong the PowerPoint, so I was expecting you to talk about this. I'm very glad you did, and you had very good overview of what's happening in this region in both the short-term and the long-term perspective, and also Dr. O'Keefe summarized very well what you found in your study. mostly aging. We can spend days and days on these topics. But with this, maybe I should invite comments and questions from the floor. And I forgot to say, yes, I was going to introduce Mr. Kwon is our former OECD ambassador, and I was going to talk about it, and he raised his hand. So why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your insightful lectures. My question goes to Dr. O'Keefe. You talked about aging society, aged society. 7%, 14% of population aged more than 65. Why do you choose 7%, 14%?
Okay, yes. I will invite a couple more and then have the speakers to respond. Okay, any other questions, comments? Yes, Dr. Jung Wing, again, I didn't introduce him. He's president of Seoul International Forum.
Thank you. I have one question each to both speakers. First to Dr. O'Keefe. I'd like to ask how you consider the technology effect in your study. Many of the technological breakthroughs these days are labor saving, not just very future-oriented technologies like artificial intelligence, but already we have many technological changes. For example, in the supermarket, actually you can get rid of all those cashiers because you have the technology to count everything you buy in the supermarket and just pay by credit card. So my question is, aging may be what we need because although at the moment we are facing the labor shortage, increasingly we are going to need less and less labor in the future. So what do you say about you talk about the female labor, immigration, how to increase the supply of labor, but the reality is the demand for labor is going to decrease. So many of your studies, I don't know how you included effect of technological changes in your study. And for Dr. Shetty, you briefly mentioned the world trade has stagnated since the last crisis, I mean the financial crisis. Do you think this global trade slowdown a cyclical thing or more structural? And structural includes changes in China, but another potentially important structural change may be the people's consumption behavior. For example, if you look at Korean population, average Koreans spend 4.5 hours every day holding this, right? If you look at them in the subway train, everyone is looking at this. So they spend 4.5 hours a day out of 16-hour waking time, right? So the consumption may be shifting fundamentally. The current metrics may not measure these consumption changes globally. And the reason may be one reason why the global trade slowdown may be the great increase of non-tradable services, which is not captured in trade statistics. So in World Bank studies, how do you account for this kind of consumption pattern changes, people moving from the goods to services, non-tradable services, internet-related services, social network services? Thank you.
Okay. Why don't I invite just one more question or comments? Okay, yes, Dr. Lee Bun-song is Professor Lee from United States.
I have several questions. First, a question for Dr. O'Keefe. You told me Korean people work a longer age, after old age. But Korean aged poverty rate is very high. First of all, you did not tell me what percentage is aged poverty rate. And I think there is some problem with your observation. If older people working late age, then they should not be poor. So maybe you are looking at overall average. First of all, I do not accept your statement saying Korean people work longer age. I don't think it's, I think it's the other way around. But if you look at labor participation after age by education level or income level, you may not see, you might find the right reason why Korea has that old age poverty rate very high. Okay, then you told me as one expectation. I'm not so sure you are suggesting this as a policy, but you are hoping women's labor participation rate increase will solve the age problem. I'm not so sure that is a feasible solution because women labor participation is entry and childbearing age. Korean women's labor force participation rate is very low, and it is very difficult to raise that. If we raise that, then women will marry early age. Our whole fertility problem will be solved. So I'm not so sure that will be solution for aging problem. And then I am curious why you did not talk about age discrimination problem. You know, I wonder, do you know Korean Social Security number has a birthday information? Social Security number has a birthday information, shows the date, months, and the year of your birth. Have you seen that kind of a Social Security number in other countries? So I think in Korea, age discrimination is a big problem. And also, age problem will be solved only when political power over aged people will be formed. Because a lot of old people think old people should provide more jobs for younger people. So older people should not be pursued their employment. So I think that kind of change will be very important. And also you say from you are Australia, so I want to ask you a question. I read in, I'm talking about your immigration solution. I read in Wall Street Journal, it says the reason why Germany is accepting about 800,000 immigrants from Syria in that area is because they want to imitate the British success story of immigration. So England did not do very well economy, but after they accepted a lot of immigrants, their economy is doing very good. I don't know whether it is true or not. Okay. Then I want to ask a question to Shetty. And, you told me there is no room for stimulation policy in developing country. Are you talking about worrying about inflation? Are you talking about worrying about capital outflow? Or are you talking about structural problem? You know, America is successful lowering from 10% unemployment rate to 5% unemployment rate. We should not just rule out saying there is no room, something like that. Then final question is, you talk about fertility control as a matter of history, but have you ever thought World Bank advised the wrong way 30 years ago? I wish I had 3 children instead of 2 children.
Okay. Okay. By the way, Professor Lee is from United States, so U.S. professor. He used to teach at the University of Nebraska, and he had the distinguished the chair there, and he has been teaching for a long time in the United States. Well, with this, would you respond, please?
Well, thank you very much for all the questions. The first question from Mr. Guan, the 7%, 14% is a fairly kind of standard thing one sees in various UN documents when they do the policy projections and things. It's not necessary. It's not magical numbers. I think one should not kind of fetishize those exact numbers. But it's just a standard kind of measure in UN and a lot of donor things of the 7%, 14%. There's a third threshold, which they say for 20% super-aged society, so-called. 21, yeah, well, 21 would make more sense, you would think, as a mathematical progression. And you know, Japan and some of the European countries obviously are in that neck of the woods. But there's nothing magical about it. The only kind of logic I would say, as somebody who works a lot on pension systems, is that, you know, typically if you're particularly in a pay-go defined benefit pension system, when you're below 10% elderly share, you're probably going to be in a significant accumulation phase of your pension system. If it's a pay-go system, you'll be taking in more than you're paying out. That starts to transition as you get towards 14%, and then clearly by the time you've got to 20%, you're probably in the drawdown state, and one sees that in Japan, where 50% of the basic pension is financed from general budget subsidies because of the balance of the population. So there's no magic about it, but it's a fairly standard measure. The technology point, I think it's an excellent point. We don't deal with it as much as we should in the report, absolutely. In fact, I would say in this report we don't deal with it much at all. We have a companion report that was done for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. In that report, it was a second-generation ageing report there. They'd done another one 5 years or so ago. They get into some of these more kind of next-level issues, and the technology issue is one that they get into, definitely. Your point is a good one. You know, will there be the aggregate demand, aggregate need for the same size of labour force, the same length of working weeks, things like that in the future? Quite possibly not. One of the things I think where ageing can actually be, and already we see in Europe, is an interesting model for what future work for many more people may look like, is flexible work arrangements where people are job sharing, where you know, part-time work is much more common, where different forms of flexible work are much more common in places like Germany, and that for older people. That may well be a much wider future of work. The other element, I think, with the pace of technology change, the life that I had and most of the people in this room would have, where you study till a certain age, you then work your whole life, and then you retire from one day to the next. The future's not going to look like that. People will have to, the lifelong learning part of that as they are working will need to be much more intensive. Career, unfortunately, when one looks at the PIAC numbers, it's the adult learning education equivalent of PISA, is doing the low, of all the OECD countries, is doing the lowest on-the-job training over the life cycle of any OECD country. So that may be an area I think where Korea can probably invest more. But I think your point is really well taken. The two initiatives on that I think are interesting at the moment on the kind of international organisation side, OECD is doing a future of work initiative, and it's looking exactly at the kind of questions you're looking at. What will future work look like in the presence of a much higher technology society, ageing, and various other factors? ILO is also doing some work on that's interesting, I think. The final point I would make on that one is, we didn't get into it today because of the time, but in the developing countries in the region, you see a very kind of bimodal labour market. urban people in places like China, Thailand, Vietnam are retiring too early. Urban women in Vietnam are retiring on average at age 52. In China, it's generally, by the time they get to 60, only I think 30% of Chinese women are working. So urban women are retiring too early. Rural people, in contrast, are working till they drop. 75-year-old men who are working on average in East Asia, who are a large proportion, 40 or 50% of them, are working 40 hours or more a week at age 75 in rural areas, often in manual work. So technology for those people, I think, will be a boon that they may not have to work till they drop in future. So there may be some kind of, different effects, I think, in urban and rural areas. On the other questions, the poverty numbers, I think I have some slides and some numbers here that we gave yesterday. If you look at income poverty for Korea, at age 60, it's about 25%. It raises to about 58% by age 75, if you look at income poverty rates. For 75-year-olds. That's income poverty. Generally, that will be higher than consumption poverty, particularly for elderly, because they have assets and savings they may be drawing down. But work by Korean academics also shows that for consumption poverty you see it would be, I don't know if it would be comparable because the US poverty line, I'd have to check on that. I don't know the answer to that, but yeah. Yeah, no, I don't know how comparable those are. So certainly, and then Korean academics who've looked at consumption poverty find a similar age pattern of it rising significantly with ages. We also see a lot of non-income indicators of, let's say, distress, poverty for elderly people in Korea are much higher. Suicide rates amongst elderly people here are by far the highest in the OECD. Depression rates, as we show in the report, for elderly people in Korea are pretty high. They're somewhat higher in China for women, but other than that, Korean elderly poverty rates are the highest that we found in the region. Depression rates are the highest we found in the region. So it's quite, the interesting question you ask then is if that's the case and people are working, what's the story? How does that all fit together? I think part of the story is the immature pension system, that in many other parts of the world people are able to draw on much more generous pensions into old age. So there's that part of income, as we saw in the slides, is at a much lower level in Korea. A second part may well be that traditional family support over time has perhaps fallen. Certainly co-residence rates of elderly people in Korea have fallen dramatically. Since about 1980 you had about 80% of people live with their adult children. Nowadays less than 30% do. So there's a host of factors. I think it's an interesting question one should dig into more. These regional reports, we tend not to dig as deeply as we might on individual countries, but I think it's an excellent question. The female labour force participation and, if women start having more babies, will they work less, and how does all that interact? If you look at the OECD countries, in around 1980, that was true. The more babies women had, the less likely they were to work. That situation in nearly every other OECD country reversed by 2009. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
My question is, I thought you are proposing if women's labor force participation increase, then old age is the problem will be partially solved. And what I'm saying is, in Korea, raising the middle-aged women's labor force participation rate is very difficult. So I'm saying that policy subscription is not feasible.
Oh, feasibility is another thing. Absolutely, that it is. I agree with you. It's very challenging. Certainly, though, the rates you have in Korea, if you don't raise female labour force participation rates, one of the reasons that will help with ageing an obvious reason is pension. You have more people contributing to the pension fund at the time that you have this rapid ageing. But there's a host of other reasons why you would want to do that in terms of output growth and things. I don't pretend by any means it's easy. Korea and Japan are really exceptions and standouts in the OECD in the fact that women, at the low rates at which women go back to work after they have their first child. It's really striking. The policies we talk about are not things like paying, they're things like childcare, possibly child allowances, things like that. That have been successful in some other countries, and there's a lot of evidence of that, particularly of childcare, and perhaps that may be an area Korea needs to invest more. I know you've been starting to invest in that. But feasibility, I agree. Final question on age discrimination, absolutely. I think one of the things we talk about on the labour force side is employer perceptions of older workers throughout the world, basically, but particularly in this region, we thought, are pretty negative often, and sometimes justified, but often not, and there's probably quite a bit of age discrimination there. The other interesting point you point to in terms of political organisation of older people in this region has been less pronounced than you see certainly in America, as you know from your own experience. The National Association of Retired People in America is one of the most strong lobbies, political lobbies that one could imagine in America. And one sees that in European countries and other countries. So I think one doesn't yet observe that for the most part in East Asia, and I think it's an interesting point. Final point that you made kind of in passing is the relationship between youth employment and older employment. This is a common kind of concern, that the more older people keep working, the less jobs there will be for young people. There's been a lot of study on this in OECD countries, and it's just empirically not the case. It's known by economists, as you would know, as the lump of labour fallacy. And in fact, the more older people work, it's mildly beneficial for youth employment, because aggregate output is bigger, aggregate labour demand becomes higher, old and young people are not substitutable in the labour market, and a number of reasons. But that concern in country after country where studies have been done by very good economists has been disproven, and they've known. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we're getting late.
So very quickly, if I may, just take the question on trade. That's an excellent question about whether the slowdown in global trade is cyclical or structural. Some of the work some of my colleagues at the World Bank have been doing, Aditya Mattu in particular, he's in our trade department, seems to point to the fact that it is actually a structural shift. That what seems to be coming out of that research is that actually the period just before the global financial crisis may have been the unusual period for global trade. That global trade expanded rapidly between 2000 and 2008, even compared to the previous decade. And what we are now seeing is growth rates of global trade trending back to what it was during the 1990s. And now we don't know exactly why, but I think one of the reasons could be that global value chains, the 2000s, the early 2000s were kind of the peak of global value chains. And China was obviously at the center of that. And think about what's happening with global value chains. What's happening is, to produce a shirt, you have stuff going back and forth across borders 15 times, right? So the cloth is put together in one place, the buttons are put together in another place, the collars are put together in a third country. So think of what that does. So global trade volumes are huge because there's all this stuff going back and forth. Now, what's also interesting, and it picks up on your point about services, is some of this research seems to be saying that that the slowdown in global trade after the global financial crisis seems to be predominantly on goods. That actually services trade is holding up much better. And the reason for that relates to a point you made, which is actually with computers and with technological change, a lot of services that were previously non-tradable are now becoming tradable. And so, when I talk about structural reform for middle-income countries, particularly in this region, I think the next frontier, and I frankly think it's true for Korea too, if you look at most of these economies, the part of the economy that is most closed is services. And there's a huge opportunity to liberalize services trade and to get productivity gains from that, in the same way that in the 1990s it was about goods liberalization. So I think that's sort of one way to think about the trade issue. On your point about macro policies and stimulus, I don't want to generalize here and say no developing country should do it. My point is simpler, which is if you look at countries like Malaysia, if you look at countries like Indonesia, if you look at most developing East Asian and Pacific countries, their fiscal situation is such that the last thing they should be doing is expanding fiscal deficits. Their tax bases are too small. Their expenditures are relatively inefficient. They have needs in terms of infrastructure that are huge. So what I'm suggesting is that really you should be these countries. So if you're Indonesia, you're already looking at a fiscal deficit of something like close to 3% of GDP. You're heavily dependent on foreign capital. What's going to happen with the Fed raising interest rates is that foreign capital is both going to be more expensive and likely to be more constrained. So you're going to find it harder to fund your fiscal deficits. You already have issues on the spending side in terms of the effectiveness of the spending. So that's the sense in which I'm suggesting that for most of these countries, structural reforms and doubling down on that. Now, there are exceptions to this. In this region, I think Thailand is the one country where I think there is scope for more expansionary fiscal policy. Now, I should just say, I'm not talking about Korea yet.
Why not monetary?
I'm sorry?
How about monetary?
Well, monetary policy is also a double-edged sword, because if you're looking at rising U.S. interest rates and you're reliant on capital inflows, I don't think you should be lowering your own interest rates. You're gonna get into deeper trouble in terms of attracting foreign capital, and you're gonna worsen your adjustment on the external side. So I don't think that's so. I think for many of these countries, I think they find themselves in a bit of a box on the macro, and the way through it, I think, is for them to really, and if you look at an Indonesia, what I would argue is that I think they actually squandered a really good period to undertake deep structural reforms because the commodity boom essentially made life very comfortable. They were, and now fortunately, I don't think countries in this region are as badly off as a Brazil, for instance. I think Brazil is, when we look back at this period of the 2000s, is going to be the poster child of having squandered an opportunity for structural reform, basically because China was booming.
Well, with these two distinguished economists, I suppose we can spend all day and talking about all the issues we have today, both short-term and long-term. In fact, U.S. Fed, I'm sure, will raise rate tomorrow, and of course, it all already reflected in the market. So I don't think it was really have a very big impact on the financial world. But however, it is the beginning of a new era. In fact, currently, as some of you must know this, but the Larry Summers and Mike Spence is engaged in debate on the effectiveness of quantitative easing. And of course, Larry Summers is fierce defender of QE, and Mike Spence is saying that it does not help much for stimulating real investment, because with this QE, firms easier to engage in more financial engineering rather than in real investment. because they're more interested in short-term profits. And therefore, in the end, it not only help, but also it may hurt real investment. But the Lady Summers, of course, come back is very strongly opposing to this. But in any case, we are living in a different world than before. I used to teach in money and banking, and at that time, quantitative easing was not the terminology in the money and banking textbook. But in any case, there's a lot of things happening. And the only thing the certain is demography. Right? It's so predictable and it's quite certain. But again, even then, we're not really ready for it, and there are a lot of things to be done, and for this country again. So I think your study will contribute much to the developing new policies and taking appropriate policy options. Well, with this, we have to end, and I really appreciate very much for your good presentations, and World Bank using this forum for releasing your major findings and policy recommendations. Please join me in thanking you.